Welcome. This is the podcast series dedicated to living a revenue culture. Long-term business survival is about creating maximum profit. And the only way you can do that is by first having a purpose-driven, people-first culture. And this podcast series is dedicated to bringing you people who are involved in that creation of a revenue culture. They have some really interesting stories to tell you and some tips to pass on. Today, we have Patrick Renvoise with us, and you're going to hear some very interesting stories from Patrick. He started his career selling, or actually, I think he started on the technical side of supercomputers, and then moved into the selling side of supercomputers, and then started exploring persuasion and neuroscience. And over 20 years ago, he and his partner put together a company called SalesBrain. And for those of you who are watching on YouTube, you may actually get to see the brain jump out here in our conversation. And they have been leaders in this industry now for over 20 years. Patrick is a recognized international global speaker. He's a TED Talk, a author of many articles. He's an author of books. He's a researcher. He's a consultant. He's a teacher. And he's one of my few friends who's a fan of extreme sports. So I welcome Patrick to our podcast. Glad to have you here.
Hey, Rick. Nice to be with you.
So I would love to have you start with your journey from going to work for, I think it was Silicon Graphics way back when, and how you got into neuroscience and neuromarketing and persuasion, and then sharing a little bit about what your work is today.
Yeah, it's been a long path to get to that, but in a nutshell, I am a nerd. I got a dual background in computer science and electrical engineering, and I spent most of my life trying to explain to very smart people why they needed to buy very expensive stuff. And the stuff that I sold was, supercomputers with Silicon Graphics. And I was always puzzled to find out that some very smart engineers sometimes could not persuade or convince anybody, although the guys had everything it took with all the rationale behind it. But when they were in front of a customer, suddenly their argument became too complicated to understand, or it was not differentiated. In other words, the customer could not understand why they should buy from them. In other words, they understood why they should buy, but they didn't know why they should buy from them. And I was competing with small companies like IBM and Sun Microsystem, etc. So companies that were much bigger than us. So I was puzzled by this fact that it is not the smartest one that wins the sale. It is the one that can express his value proposition in just a few simple words. And I found that there was no bridge between what the experts on the brain know. In other words, there are two worlds today. I am known as one of the pioneers in the field of neuromarketing. And in neuromarketing, you have the brain, as in neuroscience, how the brain works, how these 80 billion neurons connect to each other. And then you have the world of marketing, which is, I would like to sell you more of my stuff. And those two worlds, they do not communicate. And about 20 years ago, I read a book by a guy who ended up winning the Nobel Prize in economy, and his name is Daniel Kahneman. And Kahneman made an incredible discovery, but nobody in the business world knows it because he's a researcher. Let me tell you what Kahneman discovered. So I have a couple of brains here in front of me. So this is the human brain. And if we take half of that, here is what Kahneman discovered. He discovered that when we decide we don't have one brain, in essence, we have two brains. The first part of the brain is the outside, the wrinkly pinky part here. It's called the neocortex. Kahneman called that system 2. But underneath it, we have another structure in the brain, and it's made of three sub-portions of the brain. It's made of the top of the stem, called the reptilian brain, the middle brain, and then the midbrain here. And all together, this complex is called the primal brain, and Kahneman called that system 1. So Kahneman demonstrated, and that got him the Nobel Prize. He demonstrated that system 1 still wins today. In other words, when Homo sapiens decides to buy one product or another, we don't use our neocortex. we use our primal brain. I mean, it's an oversimplification, of course, what I'm saying now, but think of it that way. Whenever we want to buy something, we have a duality inside our brain. One brain says, oh yeah, I'm going to use all the rational that I know about this. It's our smart brain. We're going to think about it. How much does it cost? Can I afford it? What's the ROI? Blah, blah, blah. But underneath that, and it's at the hardware level, so it doesn't matter what kind of software you're using in your brain, right? It's the way the hardware is wired. Underneath that, system one, our primal brain is going, if I buy this, is that going to help me survive? Okay. So again, Kahneman got the Nobel Prize. He wrote a couple of books on it. He's very famous in his world of neuropsychology, but nobody in the business world knows this. So what we've done for the last 20 years is we've studied that system one, or the primal brain, and we're teaching companies how to better communicate with that brain. And that brain is not rational. It's a brain of survival. It's a brain that is pre-verbal. So it's a brain that does not even understand words. It understands pictures, but doesn't understand words. It's a brain that can only be triggered by something which contains an emotional component. So the problem is this, right? If you think about it, people that are in sales and marketing, most of them are always thinking about, how can I make my message more rational? How can I explain to my customer why they should buy from me? Well, it's great if you do it that way, but it's the long way. Instead, if you can find a way to communicate directly to the decision maker, which is system one, or the primal brain, your chances to influence or persuade people are a lot higher. So again, we've been at it for 20 something years. We wrote a couple of books about it. We've gotten a number of awards on this. And our claim to fame is we have decoded how the primal brain works. So that's what we do.
Wow. And I'm just thinking about all my years of selling, and you quickly as a salesperson recognize that it's the emotional decision to buy that wins the deal. But most of us don't know how to get to that decision. We can see it when it happens, but we're almost amazed by, oh, they've decided. What did I do?
Yeah. So you have to understand also, and that's the easiest way to understand how that primal brain works, that our primal brain is our unconscious brain. So we have two brains. We have an unconscious and a conscious. So if you can communicate to your unconscious brain, it means you're imprinting directly into the operating system of the person that decides ultimately what they should do, what they should decide, what they should buy. Now, again, the difficulty is that brain is pre-verbal, it's pre-conscious, it works only with emotion, it works with visual. So what we've done is, and we reported the whole thing in one simple poster, but we first teach people how you can stimulate the primal brain, because that brain is ancient. It's about 500 million years old, as opposed to the neocortex, which is only about 5 to 10 million years old. So that pre-verbal brain, because it's ancient, it can only be triggered by one of 6 stimuli. And those stimuli are very simple. They are personal, contrastable, tangible, memorable, visual, and emotional. So, the word stimuli comes from the medical field. So doctors tell us that if you want to communicate with that primal brain, your message needs to be, and I'm going to repeat myself, it's going to be personal, contrastable, tangible, memorable, visual, and or emotional. So from that, which is, again, the result of the research of people that have spent their life decoding how the brain works, then we can deduct a step-by-step process, which in the end is going to help you create a message that's going to have 2 effects. That message is going to be rational, so it's not going to insult the neocortex.
Okay.
But at the same time, it will have a direct way of impressing or convincing the primal brain.
Now, Patrick, when you talk about those 6 areas that create the impact, when you're teaching people to do neuromarketing, or you're teaching people to use neuroscience to sell, do they have to go through all 6 of those, or?
Well, they have to understand it. In other words, if I was going to tell you, Rick, if you want to sell more, you need to create a message that is more emotional. Well, maybe you're going to understand that intellectually, but you're not going to know how to go about it, right?
Right.
So before teaching you ways to create a new message that will have an emotional component, I have to justify rationally to you why it should be emotional. Otherwise, you're not going to do it, right?
Right.
So we teach people that portion. I mean, it can go very fast. We don't have to be very detailed, but I want to give you a very simple example of how people typically misuse or are not effective in communication. So as I said, the primal brain is a brain that is personal. In other words, it's only concerned about my survival as a client, and I don't care really about the survival of my, of my vendors. I mean, although I know if your vendors die, then you're going to be in trouble because you're going to have to find another source. But ultimately, it's all about me, me, me. And the problem is very simple. Look at how most companies communicate today. Most companies communicate by saying, well, I'm going to give you a corporate overview, and I'm going to talk about my product, my solution, my people, my customers, my vision, right? My mission statement. The customer doesn't care. So we have one element, and it's the end of the process here. But when you look at a message, you have to ask yourself, is the message written in the language of the primal brain? And the language of the primal brain is the selfish language. So if I try to sell you something, and everything I communicate is about me, 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 your primal brain is going to shut up because it's not written in the language of the primal brain. So what we tell people, and again, it's one very simple element I'm trying to describe to you very briefly, but is your message written in the you language? In other words, is it centered around the customer? So instead of saying my agenda, my engineers, my customer, my solution, me, 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 are you saying you, the prospect, will have better chances to survive if you buy my solution? But the fact that you buy my solution, I know you don't care. So when you look at a message and you go on the website, I can tell in 5 seconds if it's written in the you language. And there is a very simple test you can do. You go on any web pages of a company and you count the number of times people are saying we or I versus the number of times they write the word you or your. You do that ratio, right? If that ratio is greater than 50%, then Houston, we have a problem. Why? Because this is written in the me, the vendor language, and the customer cannot care about that. So we teach people how to completely rewrite everything they said, from their website to their PowerPoints to their brochures to their, and the test is simple. Go on the web page, count the number of we's versus you. If that's greater than 50%, no good.
I love that story, and you may have taught me that 20 some years ago when we worked together. But I now go in and I'll get somebody's proposal and I'll look at their cover letter, and which is normally about 3/4 of a page, and it's just supposed to motivate people to read the proposal. And I've seen as many as 60 first-person references in 3/4 of a page. And I can't believe anybody wrote that.
So I'll tell you my statistics of all the websites that I've visited, and I do this for a living, right? So I've visited thousands of websites. 90 to 95% of them have a ratio of we versus you, 75% versus 25%, and it should be the opposite, right? So that's one example. I'll give you another example which relates to what you were just saying. When you write a proposal, remember the primal brain loves memorable information, right? So it's one of the stimulus. Whatever I tell you today, here is what's happening, right? If I pitch you right now, you're not going to make your decision to buy, most likely. It depends what you're selling. But in most cases, you're not going to make your decision to buy right now. You may decide in 3 hours, you may decide in 3 seconds, 3 days, 3 months, or even 3 years. Yeah. So the question is not what do you communicate to your customer right now, but what will be left in their brain, what will they remember at the moment they will make the decision. Yeah. So I'm always asking people, are you building your message so that it is optimized for them to remember the good stuff in 3 seconds, 3 days, 3 months, 3 years, depending on what your sales cycle is, right? Yeah. And to make it, you have to make your message memorable. So going back to the proposal that you were talking about, you send a proposal to your customer. And imagine it's a long proposal. Well, guess what? The brain does not remember things linearly. There is something called the recency primacy effect It's one of the very first cognitive bias that was discovered. It was discovered 120 years ago by a German scientist. And it tells us that people remember things at the beginning of an interaction, they remember things at the end of an interaction, and they forget everything in between. So if you do a proposal, are you putting on the first page of your proposal the cost and the value? In other words, okay, my proposal is going to cost you $2 million. Oh, wow, that's a big number. But if I can demonstrate to you that you will save $10 million, my proposal is a steal. But if this information is too complicated and if it's swallowed in the middle of your proposal, the customer will never see it. Right? So you have to build your messages so that the important stuff is clear at the beginning, clear at the end. Now, for a lot of people, they will go, oh yeah, I know. When I do a proposal, I have an executive summary and I put but most of the people, they hide the cost. In other words, they are ashamed of their cost, right? And I'm saying, no. You should tell them how much it costs. Why? Well, Mercedes sells expensive cars, but everybody knows the cost of a Mercedes. They don't hide it, but they've been able to create the perception in the brain of people that Mercedes are more valuable than Toyotas, right? Except if you're concerned about reliability, right? So the idea is this. Knowing that the brain needs to remember the right stuff, are you building your message so that it will be memorable, so that the customer remember why they should buy from you at the moment they will make the decision? So in the proposal, we always, tell people, okay, don't put this at the very end of your proposal. On the first page, say, although it will only cost you $2 million, this proposal will explain to you why and how you will save $10 million over 2 years. Therefore, you have an ROI of a year and a half or whatever it is.
Wow. Now you're creating a really interesting question that I'm almost scared to ask, but we talk a lot about the importance of a purpose in an organization, and the purpose, if it's a purpose other than just making money, that you have a purpose that you're actually trying to make the world a better place in whatever way you're doing it. That we believe that helps you attract staff and hopefully keep them and have them be motivated. But we also believe it helps you attract customers. Now, is that a true statement from what you know?
Absolutely. From a brain science perspective, it makes complete sense. But I would have to go deeper into our model here. So from the 6 stimuli of personable, contrastable, tangible, memorable, visual, and emotional, we have deducted the 4 steps that everybody should follow if they want to have a chance to be more persuasive. The first step is diagnose the pain.
Yep.
The second step is differentiate your claims. The third step is demonstrate the gain. And the last step is deliver to the primal brain. So what you're talking about falls under the second step of differentiate your claim. But let me spend 1 second to explain the first step of diagnose the pain.
Yeah.
Now, most companies, they believe that people buy from them because they have a want or a need. So that's true. We knew that. We've been knowing this for 30 or 50 years now. But the reality is now we know better. In other words, it's not so much the needs or the wants of the customer that drives their behavior. It is those negative emotions that flood their brain. And we don't call that a negative emotion, we call that a pain, okay? So, the best example that I want to use to explain this concept of pain is, imagine if you were selling home-delivered pizzas. Well, what's the number one pain of the customer that buy home-delivered pizza? Well, sadly enough, it has nothing to do with food. And it's the anxiety of not knowing when the pizza will arrive. And about 35 years ago, a small pizza shop called Domino's came up with a slogan, and the slogan of Domino's has been for a long time, 30 minutes or less or it's free. Why? Because they figured out that the number one pain, so that negative emotion that lives in the primal brain, right? That drives their behavior when they are at home and they're getting ready to order a pizza is the anxiety of not knowing when the pizza will arrive. And as a result, the slogan has been 30 minutes or less or it's free. Bottom line is Domino's is not in the business of pizza. because nobody needs or wants pizza. In reality, they are in the business of eliminating that anxiety. So they are a FedEx organization which happen to sell pizza. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's the first step, diagnose the pain. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention about that first step of diagnose the pain is that selling is not about talking. It is not about selling. Selling is 80% about diagnosing the pain. In other words, now, if I want to sell you a pen now, right? If I want to sell you this pen, I'm not going to start by telling you the 147 functions and features of that pen. If I do that, I do not maximize my chances to persuade you. Instead, I'm going to build rapport with you and I'm going to ask you questions. So, Rick, why do you need a pen? Do you need to write in 0G? If you're an astronaut, right, you're going to need a very special pen because you're going to need a pen that's going to push the ink because you're in zero gravity.
Yeah.
So, but most people think that selling is 80% selling. In other words, that I need to tell you what that pen is about and I need to kind of show off the benefits of that pen. But that's not the best way. The best way would be for me to make you admit that you need to write in zero gravity or that you need to write inside a swimming pool or whatever. Right? So if I have 100 units of time to sell you my pen, I should spend 80% of those units of time to ask you questions. So, Rick, why do you need a new pen? What kind of pen have you tried before? How much are you willing to pay about that pen? Because if you are writing in zero gravity, the cost of the pen is not going to be that important because you're already spending millions of dollars to go up there, right? So that's the first step. We say diagnose the pain.
Let me ask you a question, Patrick. Part of what I hear, and I want to confirm I'm correct, is as your prospect, I may not be clear about the pain I have before I talk to you.
Exactly. It's just like when you go see a doctor. When you go see a doctor, you say, hey, doctor, I'm coming to you because I have a headache. I need aspirin. But you might not even realize that you don't need aspirin. You may have dehydration headaches. So it's only by establishing a dialogue between the customer, the patient, you, and a specialist, the doctor, the guy who knows everything about the product, right? It's only by establishing that dialogue, that diagnostic, we call it the diagnostic of the pain, that we will be able to establish that you have a pain that you didn't even know about. Remember that the primal brain is the brain of the unconscious. So you might not be conscious about your own pain. So the job of the smart salespeople is to make the customer talk, and the customer at the end of it goes, oh my God, I was going to buy aspirin. I don't need to buy aspirin. I need to buy more water. This guy is so smart that he helped me realize that now, guess what? I only want to buy his water. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I love your use of the term of specialist, because I don't think we often apply that on the sales marketing side, that we're specialists in helping people, understand their own needs better. And
I'll give you an example. When I sold supercomputers, my clients were Boeing, NASA, Shell, Ford, BMW, you name it, right? People were doing oil exploration, they were doing graphics design, they were doing designing planes, whatever. And they didn't need another supercomputer. What they wanted to do is they wanted to build a faster plane. They wanted to build a plane that would use less gas. They wanted to create a car that was more aerodynamics. So my job was not to push the idea of you need to buy our supercomputers. And especially, think about it, right? If there is 100 functions and features in a pen, in a supercomputer, the number of functions and features is quasi-infinite. So that would not work, right? So my job is I needed to have a dialogue with those guys to help them understand the problem. And I can give you an example. I was competing against IBM. And in the early days of Silicon Graphics, IBM did not have the visualization capabilities. So if you were an engineer at NASA and you wanted to design a new wing, you had to walk with 40 pounds of paper printouts, and you would spend your weekend flipping those pages to figure out why there was a little turbulence that was created by your wing. Well, with Silicon Graphics, we could visualize the turbulence. Not only that, but we could make the wing turn in 3D. So suddenly they realized, oh my God, I'm going to save hours and hours of painful flipping of paper pages. I'm going to be able to see myself. And that was my value prop. But the value prop of IBM on the other side was you never get fired from buying Big Blue. So that was what I had to diagnose. I had to make them admit that they had that fear of being fired if they were going to buy from a small vendor compared to IBM. On the other hand, they would spend their weekend with their wives instead of, wives or husband, flipping through the pages of that.
Yeah.
So that's the value of having a dialogue during the diagnostic phase between the vendor and the prospect or the customer. And of course, I mean, at NASA, at some point, they didn't know what they could do with all these supercomputers, right?
Right.
So that's the first step. But I want to go back to your original question, Rick, which is about why is it important to build a culture around the company, right? So the second step in our process, after you've diagnosed the pain, and your ultimate objective during that phase is to get your customers to confess that they have that pain, right?
Yeah.
They didn't know they have it, but now they're confessing it and they are making it publicly known. They are saying it to you, to the vendor, right? But they might also say it to their own colleagues and say, hey, I think we have a problem. So after you've done that, the problem is most likely if you're selling water, you have competitors. And those competitors are trying to gain business from the same prospect that you are courtshiping, right?
Yeah.
So why is it important to differentiate your claim? And why is that important to create a culture in the company around that? We started to talk about cars, so let's continue to talk about cars. Now imagine I am a potential buyer of car, I need a new car, and I could think of buying either a Porsche, a Lexus, a Toyota, or a Volvo, or a Mercedes, right? So imagine I haven't done a really good job at diagnosing the pain, so I don't quite know what I want. But think about it. What do you think is the number one pain of the guy who's going to buy a Volvo? Because Volvo has been able to establish a brand identity, which is very strong. And for most people, in their brain, they associate Volvo with safety. Right? That's the claim of Volvo. No, if you want to buy a Volvo, and if you're concerned about, having your kids die in a car accident because you're carrying them behind, most people associate Volvo with more safety. Why? Because 60 years ago, Volvo made a commitment to safety and they developed all their value proposition around safety. Now, let's talk about Mercedes. What's the positioning of Mercedes? Well, Mercedes has been positioning themselves as a luxury brand. It's not really the sporty car. It doesn't go as fast as a Porsche. It doesn't have the same performance, but it's a classy car, which is not too show off, but which still shows your neighbor that you've made it in life, right? Yeah. So if your pain is around looking like a cheapo in a car, then you're not going to buy Mercedes. But Mercedes has been able to establish that unique claim of classy car. Volvo, we talked about Volvo. Toyota, by contrast, has focused their value proposition on reliability. If you buy a Toyota, chances are you'll be able to put at least 250,000 miles on that engine. So why is that important to create that identity of each brand? Well, think about it now. Rick, imagine you want to recruit me and you work for Volvo, right? And imagine I go and meet you and I tell you about the fact that I love cars, etc. You're going to be excited. But if I start to talk about I love racing cars and every weekend I'm looking at the highest performance car, etc. Am I going to be the right engineer for you? Maybe not. Because if I am concerned about performance, then maybe I want to go work for Porsche. Now, if I tell you I'm worried about the environment and I love effective stuff, I don't want to pollute, then I'm not the right guy to go work for you. I should go work for Tesla, right? So we call that the claims. And the claims, think about it as the essence of the brand. The claims are the top 1, 2, or 3 reasons why people should buy from you. So again, in the case of Mercedes, why should people buy a Mercedes? People should buy a Mercedes because it's a classy car, right? And if I want to create a culture around Mercedes, I shouldn't change that because it took them 50 years to establish this, right? Yep. Just like Volvo, if I am an engineer and I am really interested in safety, I'm probably the right guy to work at Volvo, maybe not so at Porsche.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you can extrapolate that concept to any brand. But here is the problem, and I'm sure you know it, right? It's that most companies don't have clear corporate claims. In other words, you can look at that on our website. You know, in my estimate, 95% of all websites start with the same sentence. And that sentence is, we are, by the way, it's written in the we language, we are the leading provider of blah, 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 very complicated stuff. Now, what you need to do if people do this, right? Look at the website of your competitors. And chances are your competitors are saying, we are the leading provider of blah, 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 blah. Now, think about the confusion that is created in the brain of the prospect, because they go on website A, they see we are the leading provider of blah, blah, blah. They go on website B, C, D, and they read the same sentence. They are completely confused, right? Now, that's because most companies have not established clear claims. But what I can promise to you, and in fact, I work with Volvo, so I know this, right, for a fact. If you go on the Volvo website, somehow, somewhere, they say, we care, or you know, it's all about your safety. Right? Yep. They've established the claim once and for all. So the problem is, remember the second stimuli is contrast or contrastable. Is your message contrastable enough versus the message of your competitors? And if it's not, A, you're going to have a hard time to convince your customers. And B, you're going to have a hard time to access and interest all those engineers that you want to recruit because they don't know why they should go work with you versus others. Now, in the case of Tesla, for example, I think they've done a really good job at this, right? They've separated themselves. Now, you're going to tell me it's a lot easier for them because they were the first one with a full electric car. So it is very difficult for companies to establish claims because most likely their competitors have something very similar to them. But if they don't try to differentiate at all costs, A, it's very hard to persuade people. B, it's very hard to recruit people.
Well, and it's all, don't you have also, you were talking about, it's in their memory at the time of the decision. And doesn't the contrast help with the memory?
Absolutely. I mean, in the case of Volvo, if you and I were going to write a book called Why Buy a Volvo, that book would have only one chapter. And that one chapter in the book, Why Buy a Volvo, would be concerned about your safety. And everything would be about safety. But you know what else we would do? How many times do you think if you are going to read a book called Why Buy a Volvo, we would read the word safety? We would read that word 1,000 times.
Yeah.
Right? In fact, if I had more time with you, I would start to repeat the word pain, claim, and gain 100 times so that you would remember what's unique about my model, because it's all about pain, claim, gain, and primal brain. And oh, by the way, the fact that it rhymes is not a coincidence. It took me 2 years to find those words, because if I use a rhyme as in pain, claim, gain, primal brain, I have more chances that that information will be memorable. It will stick to your brain. It's actually one of the cognitive biases called the rhyming as a reason effect. You know, if something sounds good, people will remember it. People will be able to accept it. So there are two things that happen when something sounds good. Even if it's completely untrue, people will believe it. If you repeat something, even a big lie, many, many times, people will believe it. Right? The repetition creates truthfulness, and people will remember it.
So, wow. Patrick, we could go on for hours, but we do have a limit. So I want to ask you two things before we finish. One is, have things, you know, you've been in this over 20 years. Are we in a different place today and more likely to apply what you're talking about than we were 20 years ago? Or is it still kind of the same battle that we're reluctant to do the change necessary?
So I think that the internet is changing a number of things. And I think there is a huge generational gap now between the new generation that was born with the internet and the older generation like you and I. Right? And some of the problem that we are seeing now with the disinformation in the world has to do with the fact that people are starting to understand how the brain works. And when you understand how the brain works, you have a huge competitive advantage over anybody else. And companies like Facebook and Twitter and all these guys have a huge responsibility to make sure that we don't give the tools to people who want to manipulate us so that they become more effective, right? And I am scared because the hardware hasn't changed. In other words, only 1 or 2 generations, we went from a world where we had paper, messages, salespeople, visiting customers, building contact, to now I go on the web, in 2 clicks, I decide whether I want to buy. Right? And now my decision to buy or not to buy nowadays is based a lot on what other people think. So it's the 5-star rating, right? By the way, that uses a lot of psychology. I could explain to you in great detail why it works. I don't have a solution to make it more ethical, if you want, but I can explain to you the science behind the 5-star rating and how it's effective, right? So all this is happening in less than 1 generation. It happened overnight, almost, that internet stuff. But the hardware, our brains, they change over tens or hundreds of generations because the process of evolution is very, very slow. So I'm a little bit concerned about that. And I think that if you are, depending on the business you're in, you need to work with young people. I mean, we work with a large company in the social media. I don't want to say their names because we signed a 40-page confidentiality agreement. But one of the social network leader, right? We work with them. We were completely surprised. Most of the people there are 25 years old, but they also understand very well those, their targets. And they've learned, they have hired psychologists, so people who know exactly all the biases of our brain, and they do understand the primal brain very, very well. So there is danger there. And if you think about all the things, all the problems we're seeing in the world right now, the war in Ukraine is another great example. The level of disinformation in Russia is at maximum power right now. I'll give you an example. I'm sure you've heard it, right? They didn't call that a war. In other words, they are not allowed on the Russian channels to use the word war. They're only allowed to use the word special military operation. Why? Because that primal brain needs a tangible, simple expression. Oh, nobody in Russia, none of the Russians want to have a war. But do they want to have a special military operation? You bet they want, because they claim that it's going to get them rid of Nazis, right? Which, again, we know there are no Nazis there, and it's bogus. But a government like the Russian government right now is an expert at communicating directly to the primal brain.
Yeah. So, excuse me. Continuation and final question. What advice do you have first for organizations about how they could and should be applying neuromarketing and persuasion? And then what advice do you have, to those 20-some-year-olds that you were just talking about as to how they can make great career decisions and your clients to do
so
that?
let's start with the second question. So my recommendation to your young generation, and my son just graduated a couple of months ago, right? Is this. It's, do you know what is your purpose in life? In other words, do you know if you're interested in sports car, high performance car, or are you worried about safety? Or are you worried about classic cars? Or are you worried about the environment and should go work for Tesla? Because here is the problem, right? Every time you hear a graduation speech, people say, oh, you have to go after your dream. Yeah, okay, great. I love that recommendation. Of course we know that. The problem is, I don't know what I'm dreaming about. Or maybe I know I want to work in the car industry, but I don't know if I should be working for Lexus, Volvo, Volkswagen, or whatever, right? So my recommendation to the young generation is learn about your own primal brain. Learn about your operating system, especially the unconscious one, because that's the best way that you're going to be able to discover before you die what your purpose in life really is. And I think me personally, I had a big aha moment 3 years ago. Why? Because 3 years ago, I got a phone call from LinkedIn. And they said, Patrick, we've looked at your TED Talk, we've read your book, we've seen that. We love what you do. We would like you to become a LinkedIn instructor. And at first, I had a long discussion with them because they wanted my IP, blah, blah, blah. And in the end, I said yes. And I think that with LinkedIn, I discovered that my purpose in life is to be a teacher. And, amazingly enough, my very first job is I taught physics at the university for a couple of years. But even then, after that, I was under the illusion that my purpose in life was to be marketing supercomputers. And then I changed. I said, well, then I started a company. I started to write books. So maybe my purpose was to write books and talk about the Primal. No, my true purpose is to be a teacher and to help them understand now that they don't make rational decisions. They make decisions that are based not on logic, but based on maximizing their chances of survival at all times. And when you do that, sadly enough, a lot of people spend their life being unhappy. Because think about it. If you spend your life working at Volvo, and in reality, you are really passionate about working for Porsche, I think you've missed the point, right? And you might not die completely happy. So that's what I recommend to the young generation. I keep asking them, don't tell me about your dream. Tell me your real dream, the one that is unconscious. Who is the real you? What's your purpose in life? How can you serve the earth and the other 7 billion people on earth, right? What makes you unique? Because if you find what makes you unique and you do work for Porsche, the world will be a better place. That's the first thing, right? Then I do the same recommendation for companies. But on the company side, I tell people, what are the top 3 reasons why people should buy from you? So when I make Volvo, I work for the bus division of Volvo, for example. Volvo makes the Rolls Royce of buses. Now, for the car, they're 100% focused on safety. For the bus division, they're also focused on safety, but they happen to be the higher end buses, right? They have the ultimate bus in terms of reliability, longevity, gas usage, blah, 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 blah. So if you're a bus driver, chances are you want to drive a Volvo. The brand of Volvo for those buses is Prévost. That's the name of the brand. And they are headquartered in Quebec. Oh. When I work with them, with the bus division, I said, at the end of it, okay, they have a strange positioning because we understand Prévost is a Volvo brand, so we have to talk about safety, but your buses are more than just safe. They are also ultimate. So they worked for months, weeks to refine their messaging, and now their message is all about ultimate. So they repeat the word ultimate 3 times, the ultimate ride, the ultimate pride, the ultimate peace of mind. And they made it right, and they've been able to establish this now for several years. They've been using it, and it's created a focus now. In other words, they have a North Star, which Volvo, the bus division again, is focusing on, and they are marching in that direction and establishing that clarity of vision, that clarity of purpose. Beyond the fact that it helps with your sales and marketing, I believe that it makes a lot of people happier. Wow. Because you're not stuck into something which is not what you were meant for.
Wow.
Again, for myself, in the last couple of years of my life now, I made business decisions which were based on the fact that I finally recognized that I think my job is to be a teacher. I have a lot of people that tell me I was a good teacher. I developed 2 courses on LinkedIn. Bottom line is they already asked me to work on my 3rd course. And now I'm working with LinkedIn to expand what I did on the sales and marketing side to leadership and development. Because if you understand how the primal brain works, you can much better motivate your own employees to be better employees, right? So my 4th course on LinkedIn, I believe, will be on learning and development.
Wow. Well, I have seen one of your courses and it's spectacular. So I'm modeling some things I'm doing after what you've done. It was really, really good.
Yeah, and the beauty of the LinkedIn courses is they are free. Everybody can have them, right? And they are very short. One of the difficulty that I had when I started to work with LinkedIn is they told me, Patrick, you seem to know a few things in sales and marketing. teach me how to communicate to the primal brain. And I said, okay, do you have 3 months? Because if you want to know exactly, it took me a lifetime to learn this. I can teach it to you, but it's like, can I teach you French? I sure can, but you're not going to be fluent in French in 5 minutes. So think about the language of the primal brain like this, right? Again, we've summarized it in one poster. So the difficulty with LinkedIn is I had to slice my knowledge in small chunks that can be digested in 50 minutes or less. So, you know, the typical sweet spot for LinkedIn courses is 50 minutes. So I developed the first course. It's called the Persuasion Code Part 1. It's how to use neuroscience to be effective in sales and marketing. And then after that, I did another one. So this present the 6 stimuli and the first 3 steps, pain, claim, gain. Then they called me again during the pandemic and they said, Patrick, nowadays, people need to sell remotely. So I said, okay, we're going to write a course called Why We Hate Zoom and How Neuroscience Can Help. And they say, no, we cannot say that. So we're going to call it the Persuasion Code Part 2, selling remote, using neuroscience to sell remotely. And then the third course that I'm working on right now is going to be on closing and handling of objections. So it's going to be the Persuasion Code Part 3. And then it's going to go on and on. But the difficulty of this is teaching a language to people, right, which is a very enormous task in small chunks. So they forced me, I mean, it's taking me forever to slice what I've learned and making digestible in small chunks.
Well, and I now realize after watching the one program that your small chunks are even smaller chunks because you actually do it in about 3-minute subsections to put them all together into the 50 minutes. Because I was actually sitting there with a notepad, adding together all the sections just because I like to do math and came up with, yeah, it's a 50-minute thing. So it's very cool. Very well done. Well,
in fact, I'm happy to send you the links if you want to send it to your listeners. Again, it's for free. It goes on LinkedIn and people will learn a little bit more about the primal brain.
That would be great. Well, I have to thank you. This has been a really great session. It's amazing how your value links into, you know, helping people live a revenue culture and how consistent. You know, I guess I learned from you a long time ago because some of the things we build are consistent with what you teach. So I'm glad to see that. And I want to thank everybody else for being here today because this has just been excellent. So again, Patrick, thank you. And, you know, hopefully we'll get to do it again someday.
All right. Thank you, Rick. Talk to you soon.
We're good.
All right.
How did you feel?
Great. I know it's life as usual, right? It's what I've been talking about for the last 25 years. So I'm sure you know it as much as I do now.
Well, it just fit in beautifully. From my standpoint, it fit beautifully. And actually, we had a couple of parts of this that, you know, the purpose piece, I loved your purpose piece and I loved your final, what you would recommend for, you know, the new generation. And that just is very, very consistent, powerful inside what we try and get people to think about. So that greatly appreciated.
You know, the thing is, again, I've learned it from my own experience. I've had, you know, I mean, I was born a nerd, right? I've always loved science. At the age of 12, I was reading scientific papers. I always loved science. And I got a job as a, you know, I graduated in software and hardware engineering. It was love of science, etc. But I never knew really what I wanted to do. And I've changed jobs, I've changed countries. I worked in France, in Germany, in the US. I didn't know what I want. So, but for me, the place where I live is not that important. But what I get a kick at, what gets my energy going is when I'm in front of somebody and I'm trying to teach them something.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just don't know why, but I just love that.
Yeah. Well, I do as well. So I can appreciate that. So, well, I'm very appreciative of your time. So I have my one question I'm going to ask you, and we'll turn that into our trailer. And that's, you know, I'll ask you in 45 seconds, tell your friends and family why watching this podcast is a good idea. So If you're ready for the question, I'll throw it out.